Hello, my name is Bob Newman. I'm an ecologist and wildlife biologist in the Department of Biology at the University of North Dakota. Welcome to Nature Camp 2020, the COVID-19 edition. So I am disappointed that I won't be able to meet you in person and show you my lab in person and possibly have you come work in my lab for a little bit of time. But I'm at least happy to have the opportunity to introduce to you a little bit about what we do. So my main interest is understanding how animals are affected by the environment that they live in. And I've done a lot of work with amphibians like this wood frog that you see on this slide. And we look to see how wetlands and the conditions in wetlands affect the ability of these amphibians to make a living in the eastern part of North Dakota in the prairie pothole region. I've also done some work in the western part of the state, looking at vegetation dynamics and the influence of that on bison movement patterns. We've got GPS collars on some bison out there, and we can watch them move around, and we use remote sensing data to get that closer look at ecology, what they're facing on the landscape that they live in. And in both cases, the questions are the same. What's the environment like, and how are the animals being influenced by that? I've done a number of other types of projects as well. These two are both ongoing, but I just had a graduate student finish up a master's project on wolf ecology in the Red Lake Reservation area in Minnesota. And I've got another student working up in Voyageurs National Park in northern Minnesota. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about the projects that we've been doing in North Dakota and give you a sense of what we mean by how animals make a living on their landscapes. So I'm going to do that by showing you some slides and tell you a story based on data that we've collected already. And maybe at the end we can talk a little bit about the kinds of things that would be good extensions for this kind of work if you're interested in doing something in your own neighborhood. And this picture kind of dramatizes the challenge. So you can see a plowed field that is primed for planting. I think this picture was taken in actually end of summer, so they've already harvested and removed the stubble and all that. And what you can see there in the background, there's wetlands back there, and there are tree row off in the distance. And those are the features of the landscape that might be important. And we want to see how those features of the landscape are distributed spatially and what happens there, and whether or not the arrangement that we have of those kind of landscape features supports the important processes that an animal like that wood frog that you see there needs in order to have breeding sites and also to have ways of getting around. Zooming out to the larger extent, this is an aerial photograph taken by USDA for their own purposes, but you can kind of get a sense of what the arrangement of habitat is on the landscape. And for example, where I have that red line on there, you can see the area that we were looking at in that last picture is just to the north of that, and much of that wetland complex isn't really all that wet anymore. It's been drained and tends to dry out pretty quickly after the snow melts. But what those arrows connect, what that red line connects, is a couple of different places that are good breeding areas for amphibians. So the question is, can they get from point A to point B? And if we look across this whole landscape, does the landscape provide for enough habitat and enough connectivity among those chunks of habitat for amphibians to get around? And I'm using amphibians as an example because they're really sensitive to all sorts of things in the environment. They're small, they're not all that mobile. They can't high step across a field or fly across it the way a large mammal or a bird that is capable of flight would be able to. So they're really dependent on the spatial configuration of the right mix of land cover classes, such as tree rows and remnant pieces of grassland, or even stuff that's used for hay production, which might be okay grassland for some period of time, as long as it's not crops and they're not getting sprayed. So going back out to that whole landscape, what we do is we look to see where the wetlands are, and there's a couple of them that I flagged in this one picture, including the one that we were just looking at. So all that is based on field work. We go out and we look to see what the world really looks like. And then what we do is we take it back to the lab. This is the actual lab. If you want to think of a lab as a building in a room, so we take it back to the room where our computers are, and we collect the aerial photography that's freely available to us from the USDA. We classify that. This uses computer algorithms to interpret the picture that you see on the left into what the landscape elements are. And so anything that's kind of yellowish in that pale yellow in that picture, those are crop fields. The green are pastures or shelter belts or hay fields or something like that that's basically not plowed up, and it might be suitable habitat for an amphibian to move around in. And then on the right, we ask, if you start off at a wetland, can you get to another wetland? And we do that for a whole bunch of points on the landscape. And the purpose of that is to get some idea of whether or not the landscape is connected from the perspective of an animal that really isn't going to do very well if it has to walk across a farm field. That picture is going to look a little bit different if it's a moose or if it's a deer or if it's certainly if it's a bird. So animals that are more mobile or have more options for getting around might not have to take such circuitous paths across that landscape. But again, that's another reason why amphibians are good, because we can ask, if amphibians can get around on this landscape, then maybe it's even easier for other things. So we use them as indicator species. All right, now to switch gears a little bit. So in the last set of pictures, we were looking at how animals use the farm country that we have in eastern North Dakota to get around, and we focused on amphibians because of their ability to tell us how well connected that landscape is. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the other applications of remote sensing that we use, and that is understanding how animals use landscapes based on other sorts of features that we can see on the ground. So in the previous set of slides, we were looking at wetlands and grasslandy areas and riparian corridors and that sort of thing. And here what we're going to look at instead is vegetation quality, which is going to be an important factor determining the ability of grazing animals such as bison to get around to make a living. This picture was taken in Theodore Roosevelt National Park in 2019, I think. You can see it's just a grassy area, and vegetation can be thin in places, and we've got some invasive plant issues there. You can see some, looks like thistle there in the foreground, and there's also some yellow clover there in the field, which is okay for cows to eat at least, and also bison. But what we're going to be asking here is, can we get a sense from remote sensing data of how much plant production is there in these areas? Now, much of the remote sensing data that we get from satellite imagery or from NAPE aerial imagery tends to be somewhat coarse. The satellite imagery can be several meter pixel size, up to 30 meter pixel size, depending on the sensors that are on the satellites. The aerial photography is pretty good, like with Google Earth or something like that. You get about 1 meter pixel size, and sometimes you want a little bit finer detail so that you can see really up close, relatively speaking, what it looks like on the ground. And we use drones for that. So there I am standing out in Theodore Roosevelt National Park. Now we're in the south unit. You can see some well pads there off in the distance. Those are on the other side of the fence. So they're on Forest Service land, and inside the park is National Park Service land. I'm standing at the edge of a prairie dog town, and one of the things that we do is we map those prairie dog towns. We can fly over the area and see where all the burrows are. And we can also use the sensors on the aircraft, camera on the aircraft, to help us better understand in more detail what the vegetation condition is. So that's what we're doing here. Now this is satellite imagery, and it's a little bit dark and hard to see, but this is the north unit of Theodore Roosevelt Park. And if you go from all the way on the left where it says 615,000 to 630,000 on the right, those are in meters. So this is about a 15 kilometer, 15,000 meter width of an area. That's satellite imagery, and we can't fly all that with our little drone, but the resolution on this is a little bit coarser, and we can use the spot sampling that we do at particular locations on this area to make sure that we know enough about the details of what's on the ground in the area, and we can kind of get a sense of what the vegetation condition is across the whole park that way. And this is the kind of product that you can get out of that. So what we've done is we've taken that last picture and the sensor information that was contained within it, and we derive a thing called a vegetation index, which gives us a measure of how much primary production there is, which is basically plant growth or plant production, how much photosynthesis there is. So the greener areas, there's a lot more plant growth going on. You can see there's a river running right down. That's the Little Missouri River running right through the park. Not much plant growth going on in the water that we can detect with this sensor. So that looks pretty red on there. And then areas that are red are probably steep hillsides where there's no plants growing. Probably not, wouldn't be barren areas otherwise. So there's a lot of topography in the North Unit, hills and badlandy kind of features. And then the green areas you can see along the river, floodplain kind of situation where there's a lot of plant growth. And then scattered throughout, there's other grassland areas where the plant growth is pretty good. So we get a sense of how much the plants are growing across this whole place. We can get this kind of imagery every 2 to 3 weeks, and so we can track seasonal changes, and we can look to see how it looks in a wet year versus a dry year or a drought year. And then obviously what we want to do is know how that translates into how the animals are doing and where they're spending time. All right, so that was really brief and just gives you a sense of the different kinds of things that we can use remote sensing data for in combination with field studies, which we didn't talk a whole lot about, all trying to understand what the lay of the land is for the animals and what's there and what the conditions are and what kind of habitat it is, and then how animals respond to that as they move around in these landscapes. So we do a lot of this kind of stuff, and I was hoping this year for the first time in one of these nature camps that I'd actually be able to take some people out and fly the aircraft that you're looking at in this picture out of Oakville Prairie near Grand Forks. Obviously, we're not able to do that this year because of COVID, but maybe next year. So we might have a chance to do this yet. But in any case, even aside from the drone photography, there are things that you can do if you're interested in, and we can chat about that if you want to. Just let me know. But the simplest thing to do is just to find a place local to you, something that might be ecologically interesting or otherwise interesting to you, and see what's there. Just go visit it if you're allowed to. Don't trespass or anything like that, but go check it out, take a look, see what's there, and then get on Google Earth. That's free. You can, as long as you have an internet connection, you can see what it actually looks like on the ground. They don't update that very often, so every few years they get new pictures, so it's not like every 2 to 3 weeks. So things change, but that's a freely available source of remote sensing information that is actually pretty phenomenal that you have access to it. There are other things that you can get that are also once a year kind of things. The NAPE imagery, we can get that for any place that you're interested in North Dakota. And the kind of question that you can be asking, at least as a starting point, is what's interesting to you? What can you see in the aerial photography or the other remote sensing data? What can't you see? And what kinds of questions can you ask, and what kinds of questions can you get answers to if you have that kind of information? So there's all sorts of things that are possibilities, but it's kind of up to you what you'd be looking for. For us, we're mostly interested in how animals use those landscapes, and so we're thinking about habitat distributions and things like that. So you could be mapping wetlands, or you could be mapping grasslands, you could be mapping watersheds and rivers and that sort of thing if that's what you're interested in. And it's a little bit tougher to get information about animal locations, but it'll still give you a foundation for thinking about what's available and what opportunities exist for animals that you're interested in on this landscape. So I think I'll stop there, and like I said, if you have any questions at any point, just let me know. My contact information will be available, and thanks for listening, and maybe I'll get to meet you at some point in the future.